The drifter found a hidden home in the silo, a widow. Living there was running out of time to save it. Toby Hargrove had $12, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a grain elevator maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any silo he passed for signs of continued use. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept him fed and sheltered for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier, when the regional co-op that employed him consolidated its maintenance operations into a single traveling crew, eliminating every dedicated local position along the way. He had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The consolidation notice had cited operational efficiency as its justification, language Toby had come to recognize across 8 months of towns exactly like this one, as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a particular facility mattered less than whatever a traveling crew could theoretically manage across several counties instead. He had grown up around grain storage his whole life, his father having worked elevator maintenance for nearly 3 decades before him, and he had learned, riding along on service calls from an early age, to read a silo's condition the way another person might read a familiar face. He found the old grain silo standing alone at the edge of an otherwise empty field on a cool evening in early autumn, its surrounding farmhouse long since collapsed, but the silo itself intact. A thin curl of smoke rising from a small stovepipe someone had clearly rigged through its upper access hatch. Toby climbed the exterior ladder, understanding from the smoke that whoever lived inside had gone to considerable trouble to make the structure genuinely livable, rather than simply using it as a temporary shelter. An elderly woman met him at the small platform near the silo's base access door, her expression carrying more weary resignation than alarm. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone else found this place," she said. "Name's Louisa Beckett. I've been living here 3 months now, since the bank took the farmhouse and everything around it. I don't suppose you're here to tell me I need to leave this too." "I'm not here for any reason like that," Toby said. "I saw the smoke and wanted to check the structure's condition. I didn't expect to find anyone actually living inside." "Most people don't expect it," Louisa said. "I didn't expect it myself 3 months ago. Come in out of the cold, if you're not in a hurry. I could use the company more than you probably realize, given what's coming at the end of this week." Over the following hour, Louisa told Toby, in a voice that grew tighter with each detail, exactly what had brought her to living inside a grain silo at her age, and exactly what deadline was bearing down on her, with considerably less patience than the silo's own weathered walls. Her husband, Frank, had managed the family's finances for the whole of their 40-year marriage, and his death 18 months earlier had left Louisa discovering, gradually and with mounting alarm, that Frank had fallen behind on the farm's property taxes during his final illness, too proud or too overwhelmed to mention the growing debt to her before he passed. The county had eventually foreclosed on the unpaid taxes, auctioning the farmhouse and most of the surrounding acreage to cover the debt, though a legal redemption period had allowed Louisa, in theory, one final chance to reclaim the property if she could pay the outstanding balance plus penalties before the deadline expired. "I found the first delinquency notice in his desk after he passed," Louisa said. "Then another and another, going back nearly 2 years. I don't know why he never told me. I think some part of him believed he could fix it before I ever had to know. The same stubborn pride that kept him working the fields himself long after his own doctor told him to slow down. Men like that convince themselves that protecting someone from worry is the same as protecting them from harm," Toby said. "I don't think it usually works out that way in the end." "No," Louisa agreed. "It didn't. I found out everything at once, in the worst possible way, at exactly the moment I had the least capacity left to handle any of it properly. That deadline is this Friday, Louisa said. 4 days from now. I don't have anywhere close to the amount required, and I don't know of anyone who could lend it to me on such short notice. Once Friday passes, the sale becomes final, and whoever bought this property at auction takes full possession, including this silo, whether I'm still living in it or not. Is there any possibility of an exemption or reduction you haven't looked into? Toby asked. Sometimes counties have provisions for elderly residents or veterans that aren't widely advertised. Frank served 2 tours overseas, years before we married, Louisa said. I don't know that it matters now, this many decades later. It might matter considerably more than you think, Toby said. Some states have disabled veteran property tax exemptions that apply retroactively if they were never properly claimed. If Frank qualified and the exemption was never filed, it's possible the county owes you a credit against exactly this kind of debt. He never mentioned anything like that, Louisa said. I don't think he even knew such a thing existed, honestly. Frank wasn't the sort of man who went looking for benefits he thought he hadn't earned outright, whatever the government might have offered him on paper. That's precisely the kind of oversight I've seen before, Toby said. Veterans who qualify for something and never claim it, sometimes for decades, simply because nobody in an office somewhere ever thought to flag it for them. It's worth checking before we run out of time to check it properly. That sounds exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the money itself, Toby said. It is, Louisa admitted. I don't think I've properly grieved Frank at all these 18 months. I've been too busy being angry at him for not telling me, and too ashamed of that anger to actually sit with the grief underneath it. A man dying of illness shouldn't also have to carry the shame of a debt he couldn't face admitting to his own wife. I understand that now. I don't know that I understood it 18 months ago, in the middle of losing him. Grief and anger have a way of tangling together when someone leaves before you've had the chance to properly argue something out with them, Toby said. I don't think that makes either feeling less real, even when they contradict each other. I loved him considerably, Louisa said, and I was furious with him, and I've carried both those things simultaneously for a year and a half now, without ever quite finding anyone patient enough to let me say so plainly until tonight. Toby spent the following days doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He helped Louisa search through Frank's remaining papers, salvaged from the farmhouse before the bank took full possession, looking for any record of a service-related disability that might support the exemption claim before Friday's deadline, made the question entirely academic. Before turning to the search itself, Toby spent a morning checking the silo's own structural condition, understanding that Louisa's safety mattered as much as the legal deadline bearing down on her. He found the aeration fan Louisa had rigged for ventilation, drawing unevenly, a minor but nagging problem he corrected within an hour, and reinforced a section of the access ladder where a rung had begun working loose. Small repairs that nonetheless eased something in Louisa's shoulders as she watched him work. How did you manage to make this place livable at all? On your own? Toby asked, admiring the small stove she'd installed, the careful arrangement of what little furniture she'd salvaged. A neighbor helped me haul what I could before the bank changed the locks on the farmhouse, Louisa said. The rest I've managed myself, slowly over these 3 months. I grew up on a farm before I ever married one, Toby. I'm not entirely without my own resourcefulness, whatever this whole ordeal might suggest about my circumstances. I didn't mean to imply otherwise, Toby said. I know you didn't, Louisa said, softening. I suppose I've grown a little defensive these past months about needing help at all. It's a particular kind of humbling, arriving at my age and finding myself living in a grain silo because a man I trusted completely couldn't bring himself to admit a mistake. Frank always said a home was measured by how well it was maintained, not by how large it was, Louisa told him, watching him test the ladder's repaired rung. I think he'd have approved of this place, strange as it is, more than he'd ever admit out loud. It was in a small metal box, kept in the silo alongside Louisa's other salvaged belongings, that they found Frank's discharge papers, along with a Veterans Affairs disability rating letter dated some 15 years earlier, confirming a service-related injury that qualified him under the state's own published exemption schedule for a property tax reduction he had apparently never once claimed in all the years since receiving it. Louisa read the rating letter twice, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the VA's official seal at the bottom of the page. "He mentioned his knee sometimes, on cold mornings," she said. "I never knew there was an actual rating attached to it, a formal document confirming what the service had cost him. He simply called it an old man's aches and left it at that." "He never told me about this rating," Louisa said. "I knew he'd been injured overseas, but I never knew the VA had formally rated it, or that it might have meant anything for our taxes all these years." "This changes the calculation considerably," Toby said, working through the county's own published exemption formula against the outstanding tax balance with a pencil and the back of an old envelope, checking his arithmetic twice, given how much weight it now carried. "If this exemption had been properly applied each year since this rating was issued, I think the accumulated reduction would bring your current debt down to something considerably more manageable, possibly low enough to redeem the property outright before Friday." They drove into the county seat the following morning, Louisa borrowing a neighbor's truck for the trip, and found the tax assessor's office considerably less accommodating than either of them had hoped, a clerk explaining that retroactive exemption claims required formal review that typically took weeks rather than the 4 days remaining before the redemption deadline. "Weeks," Louisa repeated, her voice unsteady. "I don't have weeks. I have until Friday. I understand the review process usually takes longer," Toby said, "but Mrs. Beckett's redemption deadline is this Friday. I'd ask whether there's any expedited process available given the specific time constraint, particularly since the underlying disability rating itself isn't in dispute, only whether it was ever properly applied to prior tax years." The clerk, a harried but not unkind woman named Denise Coyle, reviewed Frank's discharge papers and disability letter with growing interest, her initial bureaucratic caution softening as she read further into the documentation. "This rating's clearly legitimate," she said, half to herself. "I don't understand how this never made it into his file properly." She excused herself to consult with the county assessor directly rather than continuing to process the request through the ordinary channels, leaving Toby and Louisa waiting in a small lobby that felt, to both of them, considerably longer than the 15 minutes the clock actually measured. The assessor himself, a man named Wallace Pruitt, who had held the position for over 20 years, reviewed the documentation personally and confirmed, within the hour, that the disability rating did indeed qualify for the exemption, and that the county's own error in never applying it represented exactly the kind of oversight the expedited review process existed to correct. This should have been caught 15 years ago when the rating was first issued, Pruitt told them, studying the discharge papers with an expression that carried genuine professional concern rather than mere procedural courtesy. "I don't know how many other veterans' families in this county are owed similar corrections nobody's ever properly reviewed. I'll have my office recalculate Mrs. Beckett's balance today, and if the corrected figure brings her within reach of redemption, I'll personally see that the paperwork moves through before Friday's deadline rather than getting caught in our usual processing queue." "Thank you," Louisa said, her voice breaking slightly with relief she hadn't quite allowed herself to feel until that moment. "I didn't expect anyone here to actually move quickly on this. Given everything else I've dealt with these past 18 months, you shouldn't have had to fight this hard for something that should have been automatic," Pruitt said. I intend to make certain my office reviews every veteran's file we have on record, once this particular matter is settled, so this doesn't happen to anyone else in this county the way it very nearly happened to you. The recalculation, completed that same afternoon, reduced Louisa's outstanding balance by nearly 2/3, bringing the redemption amount within reach of savings she had managed to preserve from Frank's modest life insurance policy. Savings she had been reluctant to fully deplete, without knowing whether the exemption claim would actually succeed in time. Wednesday passed in a blur of paperwork, Toby and Louisa driving back into the county seat twice more to confirm signatures and provide additional documentation Pruitt's office requested to finalize the corrected balance officially. By Wednesday evening, Louisa sat at the small table in the Silos cottage, counting out what remained of Frank's life insurance proceeds against the newly calculated redemption figure. Her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been earlier that week. "It's enough," she said finally, looking up at Toby with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and exhausted relief. "It's actually enough, with a little to spare besides." Louisa filed the redemption payment on Thursday, one day before the deadline, reclaiming full ownership of the property that had nearly slipped away entirely over a 15-year-old oversight neither she nor Frank had ever understood the significance of. The clerk who processed the final payment, a different woman than Denise Coyle, seemed entirely unaware of the drama behind the transaction, simply stamping the receipt and wishing Louisa a good afternoon, an ordinary ending to a week that had felt, to both Toby and Louisa, anything but ordinary. "I don't know how to thank you for finding this in time," Louisa told Toby once the redemption was finalized, sitting together in the truck outside the county courthouse. "4 more days, and I'd have lost everything Frank and I built together, over a mistake that was never actually mine or his to begin with. I think Frank would have wanted you to have exactly this outcome," Toby said. "Whatever pride kept him from mentioning the tax troubles, I don't think he'd have wanted his own service record to be the reason you lost the farm entirely, once somebody finally thought to check it properly." Toby stayed on with Louisa through that winter and the ones that followed, helping her slowly restore the farmhouse's foundation enough to eventually move back in, though both of them found themselves, more evenings than either quite expected, still preferring the Silos' quieter company to the larger house's empty rooms. They rebuilt the farmhouse together over the following 2 years, one careful project at a time, funded partly by the small savings Louisa had preserved and partly by odd jobs Toby took around the county in the months between larger restoration tasks. They started with the foundation itself, shoring up sections that had begun crumbling during the 18 months the house sat empty and unheated, before moving on to the roof, the plumbing, and finally the interior walls Louisa had once shared with Frank for 4 decades. "I keep waiting to feel strange, rebuilding this place without him," Louisa admitted one afternoon, watching Toby frame a new section of wall where water damage had rotted the original studs beyond saving. "I don't, though. I think he'd have wanted exactly this. Somebody willing to do the patient work of putting it back together, rather than simply mourning what was lost and walking away." He learned, over that first year, the particular history of Frank's own service, piecing it together from the discharge papers and the occasional story Louisa remembered him telling, understanding that he had, without quite planning to, become the keeper of a veteran's quiet, unclaimed sacrifice in a way Frank himself had never wanted anyone to make a fuss over. Wallace Pruitt's promised review of the county's veteran records uncovered, over the following months, 3 additional families with similarly unclaimed exemptions, each of them receiving corrections and, in 2 cases, meaningful refunds on taxes, paid in years when the exemption should have already applied. Pruitt mentioned to Louisa, during a chance meeting at the county fair the following autumn, that her case had prompted the first systematic review his office had ever conducted of veteran exemption records, a legacy she found herself feeling considerable pride in, entirely separate from her own relief at having kept the farm. One of the families we found had been paying full taxes for over 20 years past when the exemption should have kicked in, Pruitt told her, standing near the fair's livestock pavilion, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had finally corrected something that had bothered him for longer than he'd realized. An elderly widower, similar circumstances to your own. He nearly cried when my office called to tell him about the refund coming his way. I'm glad something good came out of nearly losing everything, Louisa said. I don't think I'd have wished this particular ordeal on anyone else, but I'm glad it at least meant somebody finally checked properly. So am I, Pruitt said. I don't think I'll let my office get quite so complacent about these records again, whatever else changes in this county over the years. Frank would have been glad to know his own service finally paid off something all these years later, Louisa told Toby one evening, the two of them sitting together in the silo's small stove-warm chamber, the farmhouse's restoration still several months from complete. He never talked much about what happened overseas. I think some part of him would have found it fitting that it was the reason we kept our home, even if he never lived to see it matter. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the exemption, Toby said. I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to face that Friday deadline entirely alone, whatever the eventual outcome turned out to be. I didn't expect, at my age, to find myself grateful for a stranger's knock at my silo door instead of frightened by it, Louisa said. But I am, considerably more than I know how to properly express. You gave an 18-month grief I'd been carrying largely alone the kind of company it always deserved, right when I needed it most. I think I climbed that ladder because some part of me was looking for exactly this kind of place, Toby said. Somewhere somebody had made a genuine home out of something everyone else would have called simply a ruin. I didn't know I was looking for that until I found the smoke rising from your stovepipe. Toby wrote to his own father that winter, describing the silo and the redemption deadline and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine shelter search to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the consolidation ended his elevator maintenance career. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Toby remembered him always being. Told you a good grain man's habit of checking every silo he passes would eventually lead somewhere worth staying. Proud of you for finding both the work and the person who needed you to find it, right when the clock was running out for her. Toby read that last line more than once, understanding his father meant it plainly rather than as any exaggeration, and folded the letter carefully into the same box where Frank's own discharge papers now rested, alongside Louisa's careful records of the exemption case, a small private archive of exactly how close a family's whole future had come to being lost over a debt that was never truly owed in the first place. Toby thought, some evenings that first winter, about the 8 months of towns and consolidation notices that had led him to a silo's smoking stovepipe on a cool autumn evening, and understood, watching Louisa move between the silo and the slowly rebuilding farmhouse with a security she hadn't known in over a year, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose his own father had modeled decades before. He was old enough to understand it fully. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of noticing what everyone else, including a county's own tax office, had somehow overlooked for far too long. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many honors and protections, earned through genuine sacrifice, sit unclaimed for years simply because nobody ever thought to check whether they'd been properly applied? And what does it take? A stranger checking a silo's condition out of habit? A discharge letter kept in a metal box? A county assessor willing to move quickly once he understood what was actually at stake? For 15 years of oversight to finally be corrected before the deadline runs out? If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail because there's always room by the fire for one more. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.